Alright, wait. It's like a little countdown bar, and I don't ever know. I'm going to assume we're going now, though. Anyway, okay, we're rocking and rolling, and moving right on into more discussion of literary analysis. Again, you are working on a literary analysis of Young Goodman Brown. Look again into your Canvas shell under Files, and you'll find a PDF version of that short story. That is going to be the topic of your next essay, and you're going to go about doing an analysis of that. And I hope to spend a bit of next class period talking more in detail about what specific kind of angles you're going to want to take with your analysis, because again, I don't want to see this being some sort of book report. You can use the method to get there, but there's other steps beyond just the method. And part of what we did last week in class and what we're continuing to do with this PowerPoint presentation will hopefully help you arrive there where you needs to be. So moving right on along then in our slide presentation. I'm hitting the button, but it's not moving. Okay, we saw these types of conflict last time, so that's one slide behind where we were. And then we move into types of characters, if memory serves. And technology is being uncooperative. Alright, here we go. Characterization. And so there are three kinds of major types of characters that I want you to remember for now. So there's a protagonist, who's typically your main character. There's an antagonist, which is a character or force. You know, you have to think about it. The tornado is the antagonist of a movie like Twister. Although I guess you might say Wesley from The Princess Bride is also kind of an antagonist character as well to Bill Paxton. But my point is, it is weather sometimes, and not just or the beast or the woods, the dark, whatever, madness. A number of things can be antagonists that don't necessarily have to be real life things, but keep that in mind. A foil is a character that provides a contrast to the protagonist. So I'm going to use a reference here, and I don't know, we have two of you in the room right now, but the movie The Mummy from 1999 with Brendan Fraser, which is sort of like this Indiana Jones meets, well, The Mummy kind of horror movie, kind of action-adventure movie, all kind of jammed together into a single thing. But in The Mummy, Brendan Fraser is clearly our hero, and he's, being all of his, almost Harrison Ford-esque, Indiana Jones-esque, handsome, doing his stuff. But there's another character in the movie called Benny, and Benny is sniveling and disloyal and all the time trying to just take care of himself rather than take care of others. And he's not the antagonist, he's not the villain, because of course the villain of a movie like The Mummy is The Mummy, correct. We're doing this just like Playhouse Disney now. I pause for a moment, you get to answer. But yes, the villain of The Mummy is naturally The Mummy. Betty, as a character, functions as a foil to Brendan Fraser's character. I guess you should pronounce it properly. So that's something to keep in mind. The difference between a protagonist, an antagonist, and a foil, and the ability to give an example would be useful to you in the next couple of days. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, wink, and wink. Moving right along. In terms of characterization, there are flat characters and there are round characters. A round character has a three-dimensional personality, is not just a stock, I'm a hero, I'm a villain, sort of character. That's a flat character. There's only one or two qualities and they're all bad or they're all good. A round character is a little bit in between. There's a lot more going on. I mean, think about Walter White from Breaking Bad, if you've seen that television show. Walter White is a father who loves his family, is a science teacher who's good at his work, and is a brilliant chemist, but he's also a guy who starts selling methamphetamine and starts doing some very, very terrible criminal things, and suddenly goes back on a lot of his sort of moral commitments. And all of those things remain true. They're not mutually exclusive. That he cannot love his family and also be a drug dealer. And that's that's a way in which a character can become more round. Now, does that mean that a character can't just be a good person? No. You can be round and a good person, because being a good person oftentimes means struggling with it. The good person that's flat is the good person character who never thinks otherwise. Well, think about old school Superman, where I think the best thing to do is always this, and I'm always brave, and I will always do the right thing at the right time. That kind of Boy Scouty version of Superman is very, very flat, as opposed to a good character, a good person who wrestles with doing the good thing, who sometimes, well, I think of Jesus of Nazareth, honestly, from the Gospels. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus doesn't want to go to the cross. He wants to get out of it, and he's trying to find a way to get out of it. That's unusual, or not unusual, but that's not Superman. That's definitely round character stuff, not flat character stuff. Now, moving on, dynamic characters versus static. So there's two contrasts that are working in types of characterization, and even though the arrow points at your protagonist stuff here that you see on the screen right now, this applies to antagonists and also to foils, so it applies to all of them. The dynamic character is one who grows, who changes, whose personality looks one way when the movie or the novel or the short story or the play or comic book or whatever starts, and then they look a slightly different way by the time they get to the end. Something has happened in their personality or their understanding or their discovery, that they're not exactly just the same person that they were at the end as they were in the beginning. Another example is Walter White from Breaking Bad and Michael Corleone from the Godfather movies. Both of those stories are about good men and their slow, steady damnation over time. And so that's an instance of a dynamic kind of characterization. Static characterization, on the other hand, they remain the same all the time. There is no change. I'm the baddie, I'm the heavy from the beginning, and I'm the baddie, I'm the heady all the way to the end. Think about any villain in an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. There is definitely no arc for them. There's no change at all. They don't learn anything. They don't leave things for the sequel in such a way that you say, oh, well, this will be completely different. No, there's no chance. They'll be exactly who they are and who they always were. So that's how a static character works versus a dynamic character. So you might want to know those terms and words, obviously, for the quiz, but also that you're thinking about what's happening with your analysis of Young Goodman Brown. Who's protagonist? Who's antagonist? Who are there foils? Is there roundness here? Is there flatness there? Is there dynamism here? Is it static here? Regarding various characters, it's useful oftentimes to sort of have these words, these terms to apply, and then to further your argument about what you're suggesting this short story means, and again, using characterization as the how, and the how of what it means, how it means it, which is our definition of literary analysis from the very, very first part of the PowerPoint, also quite worthy of remembering in terms of the quiz that is coming. Now, moving on. So what you can think about when you're doing analysis of a character, if you're just trying to figure out, say, Faith, who is Young Goodman Brown's wife, or Young Goodman Brown, or any number of the others, Deacon Gookin or whomever, as you're reading that short story, you think about the character here as you look at the slide, and I'll sort of circle it with my hand icon here. You think about the character here in the middle, and you can think about sort of internally about the character, how this character acts or feels, the actions that it takes, that the character takes, those things, and if you have any sort of internal monologue as to what their emotional state is, that's a good indicator of at least their own self-understanding. And then, of course, what they say, the words that are actually said about them. But on the other hand, also, you've got external factors about characterization. How a character, that was a zoom in, let's zoom back out. How a character looks is very important. Oftentimes, you find that the descriptions of characters are also clues to who they are, what they're about, everything from how they're dressed to specific facial features to whatever. So what the character looks like can be very, very important, and what, again, sort of descriptors are laid down with them. Josiah. And then how others feel about this character are also very, very important. So what other characters say or feel about them, which may work in contrast to how the character may feel or speak about him or herself. So using that sort of Venn, this is not a Venn diagram, but that sort of cross-sectional, excuse me, that sort of cross-sectional approach can be really useful for further literary analysis. So there is something to think about. All right, moving on. My dog will ever stop barking. Apologies for that. I guess every professor's dog or cat is becoming a semi-celebrity in the time of COVID. I hit the next slide button, I thought. It's very delayed in responding. I never know if I'm going to overstrike it or if it hasn't gone at all. We're getting to it, gang, I promise. Alright, I'm going to skip to slide 14. How about that? Did it work? It feels like it didn't. Oh, technology is great when it works, gang. Give me just a second. Oh, alright, here we go. We came up. Alright, so here's another chart that you can use. You can copy paste it or whatever you want to do into how you want to do this. I'll make it full screen, I guess. You want to take a screenshot and print it. So this is the full screen view of this, but it's a little chart of what you can do with your individual character analysis. Again, this is more like method stuff. This is not the analysis, it's how you get to the analysis, how you get the pieces for an analysis. And so, on the side, what the character says or does, a quote from the character, detail about the character, events about the character, a comment about the character from somebody else. Write all that down. What I concluded about the character based on the information. Big, abstract ideas, not concrete, factual information. Not saying, okay, so there's there's a black coat on a man on a dark, dusty street. That's the first description that you get. And you say, clearly this person likes to wear black. That's concrete. The abstract is, you're supposed to get a sense of menace. Man in a black coat on a dark street. So all of those descriptors, which are, again, more in the sort of avenue of darkness, they are trying to help us see that this character is not a good guy, or at least we are not to expect him to be a good guy at the very first. So we'll move on with our analysis from there. So that chart, I hope, will be helpful to you in your analysis of Young, Good, But Brown. You should be using it. You really, really should. Now, characterization. When we're talking about what characterization is, it is looking at all of these things: a character's actions, a character's choices, their speech patterns, their thoughts and feelings, their comments, their physical appearance, and their name. Names of characters matter very, very much. Think about way back in your sophomore high school English class, in which you probably read Edgar Allan Poe's The Cask of Amontillado. The guy that gets walled up in the basement's name is Fortunato, which is, again, sort of a pun for fortunate. He is not. It's a good pun. It's a good joke. And so it's sort of almost a misdirect. But that's an intentional choice. And oftentimes, names mean something. Goodman Brown might mean something. Faith Brown might mean something. These are things to consider. So the names are important also. Other characters' thoughts and feelings about the character, and other characters' actions towards the character, which is basically what we were just describing just a few moments ago. That these things all help us to wrap our brain around what the author has inserted into the text to give us a sense of the character. And then from there, knowing how the author means it, we try then to figure out what exactly they are trying to say by looking at the details, because oftentimes we miss the sort of accumulation, the sort of the word I'm looking for is escaping me right now, but the way in which the magnitude of those details work together to achieve a certain idea. And sometimes if we're not paying close enough attention, we let them wash over us, and we miss part of the depth and the layers that we might experience reading a given story. So this is a good tool and good tip just in general, but also specifically for this project. All right, moving on. Setting. So you need to always be thinking about setting when you're doing analysis as well. And this may be one of the more important points regarding Young Goodman Brown. So you want to think, again, first of all, we got the first three bullet points there on the left side. Time period, geographical period, locations, and historical and social context. Young Goodman Brown's interesting because we've got two time periods to think about. Nathaniel Hawthorne is writing the story in the 19th century. And the story is set in the 17th century. And there's a gap of a little less than 200 years between these particular events. Therefore, we've got to think about what's going on in the 1800s. We've got to think about what's going on in the 1800s and what's going on in the 1600s. Because both of those time frames matter quite a lot to understanding the story. So the time period, part of your research probably ought to be what's going on in the early 19th century in the United States. There's a war cooking up, I'm just saying, and some other things that have been happening in the world. So that's one thing to consider. And then also think about, well, what do we need to know about the Puritans and what's going on with those early 17th or late 17th century early settlers and colonists to the United States, long before the Revolutionary War. So a number of those things going on. Geographic location. The location, Salem. Salem is a town with some history. Obviously, we know about the witch trials, but also Salem is part of that area in which some of the first colonies are established. The Bay Colony, the Massachusetts Colony, they're all quite famous, and there's quite a lot of writing and texts that are preserved from that time period. So that particular bit of geography is also, I think, fairly crucial. Now, historical and social context, this is where we really live when we do analysis, because sort of part of what I'm pointing you to is how you figure out where to go for historical and social context, and that is by going into the time period, by looking at the geographical location, all of that. But historical and cultural context, so what's going on socially, again, 19th century. There's there's an abolitionist, anti-slavery movement working in the world, and of course this is New England. That means it's the North, not the South. So that all matters. So a lot of stuff going on. The politics of the time, as we've already said, very, very interesting. Spiritual stuff, also important, especially when you start thinking about the Puritans. The reason why they left is for religious freedom, because they want to practice Christianity in a very specific kind of way. So some of your research probably ought to direct you into figuring out a thing or two about Puritans and who they are and what they're about and how that would connect to the events of Young Goodman Brown. And again, just the historical context of the witch trials themselves. But as you see, working from left to right rather than from top to bottom now. Time period, instrumental in establishing mood, oftentimes. The location, they symbolize emotional state of the characters. I cannot tell you enough how much this period of literature uses city or urban or village or civilized space in opposition to wilderness, to outside, to country space. And so you really want to think about not just like an inside-outside kind of thing like you see in like John Ford's movie The Searchers, the Western, but think about a civilized space, towns, cities, villages, and uncivilized, the country, the wilderness. Those contrasts are oftentimes very, very important. And this, of course, makes sense for it to be an important part of early American literature because the outside was actively trying to kill them, right? The elements were the antagonist of the story of a colonist, among the antagonists. And so thinking about it that way, yeah, of course, there is going to be a huge contrast there. So historical, social, cultural context, as you see moving from left to right now, that has an impact on the characters' motivations and their options. So whatever the historical context is going to impact what they do and what options make sense. And so this all still applies a lot to what happens in the story. So keep that all in mind. Now, moving on to the next slide. maybe. And here we go. So here we go. Here's the chart that you can use, and again, I'll make this full screen so you can screenshot it if you wish. As you see here, we have various historical time periods. So, and then another column says concepts developed or revealed, and then events, examples, details that support these concepts. So you're thinking about, okay, so the historical time period, 19th century stuff, antebellum, pre-slavery, maybe some other things going on in Massachusetts. I think your research is going to be revelatory here. You write down those concepts, and are there details in the story that sort of point at those concepts? Then you look at the 17th century. So the witch trials themselves, the events of Salem, those things are really where you want to bear down your emphasis and your concentration. You're going to find concepts and then details from the short story, again on that far right column, that are going to help you see how it reveals or supports or expands or refutes those ideas as you're seeing them. So it's useful to think about those kinds of stories and those kinds of details in that way, and to chart it out like that. Because once you've got all that paper in front of you, and then you say, okay, so now I want to write an analysis, and I want to say this story is doing this, that there's an intended meaning that Hawthorne is trying to say about, well, let's say guilt as one possibility. Now we'll go into these possibilities in detail next class period. Say guilt, or about religion, or about civilization, or a number of other possibilities. We'll talk more about this next time. That's all there. So those are all good ways to get all that information in front of you, and then you say, oh, now I've got all my details that I can use and quote and contextualize and paraphrase alongside with my research sources to make this argument that this is what the story is saying, and this is what it means culturally. So that's, I think, very, very helpful. All right, moving on. Maybe. Yep, okay. So, point of view. This is just something to think about. Just be aware of this. There's questions on this. I don't know how useful it is necessarily for your Youngman Brown analysis, but you want to think about first person, third person point of view writing. First person, obviously, the first line of Moby Dick, call me Ishmael, and the whole time Ishmael uses me and I, first person pronouns, to talk about himself and reveals the story of himself and not of others. Then there's the three kinds of third person kind of narration. There's objective, where the narrator is kind of outside the story and acts as a reporter, cannot tell what the characters are thinking, just sort of relates the events. So that's an objective narrator. So there's no inside the head when you're doing objective narration. Limited, usually they can see in the mind of one of the characters, but not the rest. And so sometimes a limited third-person narration takes place. Or omniscient, where the narrator of the story is God, basically, and knows all things in all people's minds at all times. And of course, the different points of view are helpful for different kinds of stories. You don't want an omniscient, all-knowing outsider mind if you're reading a mystery story. Why? Because you want to be just inside the head of your Sam Spade. And maybe not even inside. Think about this. Sherlock Holmes. You don't really want to be inside Sherlock Holmes' head as he's figuring out. You want to be on the outside of his head when he explains it and you're amazed. So objective narration sort of works for Conan Doyle, although he does do a little bit of limited sometimes by using the John Watson character as kind of a go-between, an everyman to help us get through. Depending on that, the Conan Doyle fluctuates, and he's not a great stylist by any stretch. But anyway, you see the ways in which these kinds of narration are working, and that's just important to keep in mind. All right, moving right along. More things and more things. I do believe the button is working now. It's just going very, very slowly. Okay, yeah. All right, so analyzation itself. How do you do it? Analysis. Look at some rhetorical elements in the story. That can help you figure out what's going to happen later, and then also what's important in terms of the story. So foreshadowing, as you know, is the use of hints or clues to suggest that an event will occur later in the story. It builds suspense, means making the narrative more believable. And so oftentimes there are foreshadowings. Think about the cold open of a TV series where you see the terrible thing happen, and then you go back after the title credits run and the first set of commercials run, and the TV show comes back on, and then it says 6 months earlier. What do you expect? Well, however they got there, we're going to get there by the end of this episode of this season, right? The second season of the NBC series Hannibal does this, where you see Lawrence Fishburne and Mads Mikkelsen in this crazy knife fight inside of Hannibal's kitchen, and that's how the season opens. And then it cuts to the title credits and commercial or whatever, comes back, and it's 6 months earlier. And it ends up taking the whole season to get you there, but nonetheless, it's a foreshadowing. You know where this is going, and even though Lawrence Fishburne's character is buddies with Mads Mikkelsen's Hannibal character at this point, you know it's not going to last. And so it builds your suspense, and it does in some ways make the change, because you're expecting it now, somehow more believable when their relationship suddenly turns on a hinge there. All right, so tone, the author's attitude, stated or implied towards the subject, revealed through word choice and by details. So, are they horrified by what they describe? I think about this a lot. We talk about horror movies or horror novels. I read a lot of Stephen King novels and other Gothic novels of the 20th and 19th centuries, and 21st centuries, I guess, some too. And it's interesting to me that there is a lot of bloody, grossy, goopy kind of stuff that goes on in those stories. However, in terms of tone, you can sometimes people say, I can't believe Stephen King, I can't believe this writer, this whatever. You must be sick, you must be twisted because you keep describing these kinds of things. But if you look at the word choice in terms of tone, you can clearly see, especially in the case of Stephen King, that they are horrified by this. It is not as though they are glorying in the bloodshed. They are scandalized by it. And the intention for the audience is to also share in that scandalization. It's supposed to be really, really tough for them as well. So, and again, word choice sort of helps us see that. Again, the attitude towards the topic, it could be whimsical, it could be silly, it could be, sarcastic. I think about a Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift, this little short essay where he's talking about the problem of starvation of Irish children, and he recommends, well, I guess they won't starve if we ate them. He doesn't mean it. It's sarcastic. Sometimes I teach this and I get letters. But no, he's sarcastic. He doesn't mean it at all. But he goes on to talk about how you should eat the Irish to save the surplus population problem, and which is nuts. And so clearly the author's attitude, though, there's a shift there. And Jonathan Swift's pretty brilliant in the way he hides it, the first handful of paragraphs of the essay before you get there. But you get this idea of like, okay, my tongue is firmly planted in my cheek. It's totally a joke that I'm attempting to make here. So that's, I think, a useful thing to think about there. So tone, word choice, and details to describe, again, setting and just the subject matter at hand. Now, more rhetorical elements to analyze. We're just going through a list of them. Mood, the climate of feeling in a literary work. And this is established through the choice of setting, object, details, images, and words. If it was a dark and stormy night, it's a particular kind of story which has a particular kind of mood, right? There's a feeling there. If it's all the time fog in the wilderness and in the graveyard and the bats, hanging upside down in the attic of the house, there's a particular kind of mood that's trying to be established there. That's pretty clear. So you want to think about what kind of mood is being established, and then use that to figure out what this then could possibly mean. Okay, is it dark and spooky just because dark and spooky is fun, or is it dark and spooky because the author is suggesting these kinds of issues ought to haunt us? And that's why they use these sort of haunted descriptors. Moving right on down. Symbolism. Person, place, and object, which stands for more things. Are there symbol-like things? We know this stuff already. An American flag equals freedom. A dove equals peace. That little green triangular circle, we know that universally means recycling. The gavel and the scales means justice. The ways in which those kind of things are stand-ins for other things. Are there objects which stand, or persons or places which stand for more abstract ideas? And again, there's other layers of this. I mean, if we start saying Washington D.C. says we should all stay inside. Washington D.C. is a city, right? What are we saying when we say that? Well, we're saying the government says. We're saying the federal United States government is saying so. And so that place is a symbol. It's actually a metonymy, which is a different kind of symbol, but it's still a symbol for that particular kind of idea. Just remember symbol, not metonymy, but it's the same basic concept. And so those kind of things, if you see that at work in a short story or a novel or a movie or whatever you're reading, then it's probably important to pay attention to why it's taking place in the way that it is. All right, moving on. More rhetorical elements if memory serves. There's only a few more slides in this, I think. Irony. You do want to remember these three particular types of irony. Okay, it's a contrast between what is expected and what appears and what actually is. So verbal irony is a contrast between what is said and what is meant. So verbal irony is where I say, sure glad it's raining. I'm not glad, but that's the joke, right? And so it's a verbal irony. I say something that's clear, I don't mean it. Irony of situation is an event that is the opposite of what is expected or intended. So irony of situation is where I pick up the gun as I'm standing off against the villain, and I point it in his face, and then it goes click. And I look at it, and it's not loaded, never was loaded, and I've been tricked. That's irony of situation. Right. Then dramatic irony is the audience, the reader knows more than the characters know. So if we as an audience knew it was unloaded, that would be dramatic irony. Oftentimes, dramatic irony, you see it working in like a romantic comedy where he does something that really much offends her, but there's actually a very good reason for him doing the thing he did, and she misunderstands. And we're like, no, you guys shouldn't be fighting. It's not what you think. And the whole rest of the movie is us sort of rooting for them to figure out the truth, which is part of what the movie does to help us root for them being established as a couple. That's how dramatic irony works. Well, you know more than the characters know. And so that's like a horror movie's got dramatic irony, where you see the babysitter going up the stairs, you're screaming at the screen saying, no, don't go upstairs, because you saw the last scene where the killer climbed in through the window. And so you know, but she doesn't know. And it makes you crazy. Or, well, it amps up your suspense, is what it actually does. And that's how dramatic irony works in a literary work. Moving on. All right, so more of these. Figurative language is another bit of rhetorical elements. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time with these. I think you know what they are. Simile, like, metaphor, is. So love is like a rose is a simile. Love is a rose is a metaphor. Alliteration is where the story uses repeated, and then poetry's much more commonplace to find alliteration, repeated consonant, usually consonant uses. So Peter Piper pecked a pickle peppers. I can't even say it. That's a tongue twister, but it's also an example of alliteration. Personification, that's when a object that's inanimate takes on human or human-like characteristics. And so suddenly the sea becomes angry. Well, seas are not angry. Seas don't have emotional lives. But yet we use that kind of language and we personify the ocean. Onomatopoeia is language of sound. So bang, boom, slap, pop. Biff bang, wow bang, Batman cartoon stuff. That's onomatopoeia. Finally, hyperbole, if I can say it. Hyperbole is exaggeration. Simply that. If you would take the speck out of your neighbor's eye, take the board out of your own eye, says Jesus in the Gospels. That's a good example of hyperbole. It's great. It's a good example of this extreme kind of language, exaggerated kind of language. So, moving on. So when you're doing your writing here, I think this will be the last set of 3 or 4 slides here. Your introduction for your analysis. A literary analysis is a paper that gives a deep, illuminating explanation of a literary work. It is critical interpretation. You will learn how to formulate a deep thesis, organize the paper coherently, and use a number of these methods. So here we go. How are we going to do this? This is for your paper. Okay, actually, that's where I'm going to stop. Yeah, that I was planning on stopping there. So that's it. Next class period, we're going to talk about actually writing the paper. And I'm going to talk about sort of your options and your avenues about going about doing all that. So we'll come back to this next class period. Everything that has preceded this, though, in this particular PowerPoint presentation, those 22 slides or whatever it is before that, that's going to be on the quiz. That'll be available. I'll try to make it available. I'll try to work on it today or tomorrow. I've got a big presentation for one of my other classes that I'm taking, not teaching, and so I don't know what my time frame is going to be, but it'll be up by Thursday, and I'll give you till noon on Friday to finish that. So that's where that'll all come down. But anyway, good seeing you guys, Matt, Riley. Good seeing you two here in the room, insofar as I could. And we will call it a day, and we'll see you next week.